what are some of the things that listeners or people who are watching can take away from investing during times that are tumultuous?
In Toronto right now, where I live, prices around where I live and even just around the greater Toronto area, they've really taken off during the pandemic. They've risen 25, 30% a year over the last 2 years. And it's really not sustainable. And so things have started to cool, right? Interest rates are starting to go back up. There's more fear in the market because of that, rates rising. And I would say, like, as an investor, these are actually times of buying opportunity. So for me, I've always focused on buying positive cash flow properties. So what that means is really buying something that covers where the rents cover all of the operating expenses as well as the financing and leaves some left over. What that does, I think, is really protect against the downside risk in the event of a downturn or in the event of a market correction, because you're not necessarily just speculating. So I personally, from a strategy perspective, didn't want to just buy a property and hope that it went up in value. And I didn't want to buy something that was way overpriced so that I would be feeding it every month because, the rents weren't going to cover it. So I think from an investment perspective, going through tumultuous times and going through recessions, it's really trying to pick up properties that can continue to cash flow, whether there is a recession or not. And that's making sure that when you buy the property, you're buying in areas that are desirable, in demand, either from a job perspective and like the economy is growing, the jobs market's strong and population is growing as well. And those are some of the things that, as long as the fundamentals in the market are good and strong and you have positive cash flow, that will take you through those tougher times.
So how have you been able to find those properties, right? Because I'm sure everybody wants to buy cash flowing properties, but how have you been able to find these deals?
One would be not necessarily focusing on the main metropolitan areas. I'm not necessarily looking for properties in Toronto where the prices are very high. I'm looking at secondary markets an hour or two out from the main city. What I found is that the rents are still quite good and you're not paying as high prices. So that helps in terms of making the property be able to cash flow. And the second strategy I would say is looking for opportunities in properties where you can have multiple units within that same property. You could add a legal basement suite as well as a third unit potentially where you add a what's called a garden suite, an accessory dwelling unit in the back that you can rent out separately as well. So you can have one piece of land and have basically three different ways and three different tenants to cover the operating expenses and the financing costs for those properties. And that helps transform that property where if you just thought of it as like, I'm going to buy one single house, maybe that's not necessarily going to work. But if you took that house and turned it into three different units, those numbers will work. So it's really trying to be creative and look for ways to add value and look for different ways to profit from that one piece of land.
That's a jam. So do you use property managers or do you manage all these properties?
It's a hybrid approach. I would say like the ones still as student rentals that I still own, I manage those myself. I kind of started with that and I never let that go. I guess one day I probably will, but I still have not let that go. But in terms of other areas, whether that's areas, let's say an hour or two away from me or out of province, those I have property managers for and who look after it. And they've been great. I think the key to scaling your portfolio is really figuring out how you can leverage your time. I found out early on that there's only so much time that you have, especially with full-time job, family. And so it's trying to figure out how, your best use of that time in. So it's really leveraging the expertise and experience of other individuals that can help deal with and take those phone calls that conveniently happen when you're on vacation and that you don't want to take. So finding those people, good property managers to help manage, those can really help go a long way towards scaling your portfolio.
Can you think of a failure in real estate and what you've learned from it that you can share with us?
Yeah, I would say a couple of failures. One would be in the beginning. So going back to the trying to do it all, I would say that first property that I bought, whenever there was problems, let's say from a maintenance perspective, I would try to do it. And then I'm not even the greatest of handy people. So I would talk to my dad and he had a friend that he would bring from Toronto. We would drive for like an hour and a half to this property. The repair would take more than what it normally should take because we're trying to figure this out as we go. And so what I learned quickly from that was, you know what? for areas where you're not an expert in and you don't have the time and patience to figure out, go and hire people who are well qualified to do that, right? So that I would say from a failure perspective, that's time lost. And then other examples I can think of and lessons that I've learned since the beginning is that in the beginning, I think I started to get more caught up in trying to get the best deal. So let's say negotiating, trying to negotiate that if it's a difference between 5 or 10 or 15 or $20,000 and you're trying to get the best deal and or make sure that you're protected from all risks. So I remember there's a couple of situations where I tried to buy property and I was negotiating with the seller where it became overly complicated. And stepping back, I could have just made it a lot simpler and I would have that property today. Ultimately, I didn't end up getting those deals because it ended up overcomplicating things to the seller, or even in terms of price, we weren't able to agree on a price when we weren't even, in hindsight, we weren't that far apart. So I think those are some of the things that I've learned along the way. So just try to put that into practice as I continue to evolve here.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of times we put a lot of emphasis on how much we're spending, but not necessarily taking into account how much time we're saving, how much our time is worth. I'm really glad you pointed that out. Piggyback on what you said earlier about purchasing cash flowing properties, when you mentioned that, you lost some deals because you were just trying to get the best deal. In those scenarios, you were already cash flowing, but you were just trying to maximize. So that's a great lesson there as well. But for anyone that's watching the show, wanting to get started, do you have 3 to 5 steps that they can take to get started building wealth through real estate?
Yeah, I would say the first step would be to really get yourself educated about what you're doing. So, for example, let's say if you're looking to invest in real estate in a certain market, start to understand what's going on in that market, what's happening from an economic perspective, what's happening from a job perspective, what are the drivers of that market. So, get yourself familiar and going with that. And I would say the second thing would be to do is really build up a network of people that can help support you. So, whether getting in touch with an investor focused realtor, not necessarily someone who's just doing real estate buying and selling houses for people living in them, but really someone who's very conversant from an investment perspective. Like when I started to build my portfolio, it was really gaining confidence in the realtors that knew that market, that knew what the market rents were, that knew what these properties were worth, that could tell me all the ins and outs of it. So really focusing on building up your team of people to help support you in your journey. And included as part of that would be finding mentors, right? So I remember vividly early on in my real estate career, I joined a real estate investment network group. And that was really a way for us to get together every month and talk with and meet with other like-minded investors. Because if you're not in the real estate space and thinking about it and talking to people about it every day, it's very easy to get distracted and caught up in other day-to-day life, right? So you always want to find a group of people that you can run things by in terms of, does this make sense, or what's your experience here? And that provides further confidence to you as you go out and source deals or go out and invest in properties. It gives you that confidence that you have someone to turn to if you ever need help. So I would say that's a big part of it as well. And just, yeah, finding mentors and people to support you on your journey. Some people who have done it before, who have experience of what chart you're trying to do. They always say success leaves clues, right? So a lot of what we're doing is it's already been done. You just need to make sure you align with and find people that you can follow and that have done what you're doing. And that's one of the quickest ways to get to where you want to go.